The cold air of the autumn evening seeped through the cracks of the old house, wrapping itself around every corner as she sifted through the pile of mundane mail. Bills, advertisements, a postcard, things she barely glanced at anymore. But beneath it all, something peculiar caught her eye. The envelope was aged, its edges yellowed and brittle. There was no return address. The paper, rough to the touch, seemed out of place, as though it had traveled through time to find her. A shiver crept down her spine as she held it in her hands, hesitant but curious. She examined it closely. Her name was written on the front in a hurried, almost trembling script. The ink was faded, and though there was nothing particularly sinister about it at first glance, an inexplicable sense of dread coiled in the pit of her stomach. She knew she shouldn't open it, but the temptation was too strong. With trembling fingers, she carefully tore the top of the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly, waiting to be revealed. She unfolded it, and her heart skipped a beat. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was from him, a man who had died years ago. She could barely remember him. A distant family acquaintance, someone from her childhood, long forgotten. But his name was there at the bottom of the letter, scrawled in that familiar hand. As she read, her breath caught in her throat. The letter was disturbingly personal. It recounted moments from her life, moments no one could possibly know, childhood memories, hidden fears, and recent heartbreaks she hadn't even spoken aloud. The words seemed to know her better than she knew herself. And then, at the bottom, a single chilling line that made her blood run cold. "You will see them soon, one by one." The room suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in around her. Her breath came quicker, and her eyes darted around the room. The house was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind against the windows felt amplified in the silence. She lay in bed, clutching the blankets to her chest, the letter still on the nightstand beside her. The words echoed in her mind. "You will see them soon, one by one." What did it mean? Who were they? She tried to convince herself it was just a cruel joke, maybe something meant to unnerve her. But no one knew those details about her life. The memories the letter described were hers alone, moments from her childhood she had barely thought of in years, secret fears she had never spoken of, the recent loss of her beloved dog, something she hadn't shared with anyone. All of it was written there, as though the writer had been watching her every move. Unable to find peace, she sat up in bed, turning on the lamp. The dim light bathed the room in a pale, ghostly glow. She picked up the letter again, her fingers tracing the faded ink, wondering how it had arrived, how it even existed. She remembered the man now, faintly. His name was Robert, someone her parents had known in passing. He had always been strange, quiet, but she could never have imagined this haunting intrusion. Her thoughts spiraled, and a creeping sense of dread settled into her bones. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something, someone, was watching her ever since she read the letter. The air in her home felt thick, oppressive, like an invisible weight pressing down on her. Every shadow seemed to move when she wasn't looking. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally overtook her. Her eyes fluttered shut, and she drifted into a restless sleep, the letter still clutched in her hand. Sometime in the middle of the night, she woke with a start, her heart pounding. The house was dark, silent except for the faint rustling of wind outside. But something was different. She strained her ears, trying to listen past the ringing of her own pulse. A faint, almost imperceptible noise. A breath. No, more like a whisper. A soft, barely there murmur. She sat up, her throat tightening with fear. The sound seemed to be coming from the hallway just beyond her bedroom door. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. but there was no service, no signal. A flicker of panic sparked within her as the whispers grew louder, closer. She held her breath, heart hammering in her chest. The door was shut, but she felt it, the weight of something just outside, watching, waiting. She turned toward the door, her eyes wide, as the whispering stopped. Silence hung in the air like a heavy fog, thicker than before. Then, without warning, a slow, deliberate creak came from the floorboards just beyond her room. Someone, something, was there. Morning arrived, but the cold dread that had wrapped itself around her heart in the night remained. She couldn't ignore it any more. Something unnatural was happening, and the letter was at the center of it. The whispers, the creaking floorboards, the oppressive weight of being watched. They weren't imagined. She needed answers. Determined, she went to her computer and searched for any mention of Robert, the man who had written the letter. His death had always been a murmur of tragedy whispered by the older members of her family. She barely remembered the details, but as she delved deeper into online archives and obituaries, the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest only worsened. He had died nearly a decade ago, in what was officially ruled a suicide. But even then, people had talked, whispers about dark rituals, about things better left unspoken. His body had been found in the attic of his crumbling old house at the edge of town, a place no one visited anymore. Strange symbols had been carved into the walls around him, and though the police had dismissed it as the ramblings of a broken mind, local rumors told another story. She found an article, yellowed and buried deep in the archives, about his burial, a small, neglected cemetery just beyond the town's limits. No one visited his grave. Most had forgotten him entirely. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the screen, the feeling of being pulled toward that place growing stronger. There was only one thing left to do. That afternoon, the sky was overcast, heavy with thick grey clouds as she drove through winding back roads toward the cemetery. The world seemed quieter than usual, as though even the wind was holding its breath. The trees, bare and skeletal, stretched their bony limbs toward the sky, adding to the gloom. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she saw the cemetery come into view, overgrown and forgotten, as if the earth itself had tried to erase its existence. She parked at the entrance and stepped out, her breath visible in the crisp air. Her feet crunched on the frost-kissed ground as she made her way between the rows of decaying tombstones, her heart pounding in her chest. The graveyard felt abandoned, lost to time, but as she ventured deeper, she felt something stir in the air around her. At last, she found Robert's grave. The tombstone was cracked, its surface worn down by time and weather. Moss clung to the edges, obscuring part of the engraving, but there was no mistaking it. Robert's name was etched into the stone, along with the date of his death. But what caught her eye was something else, faint, almost invisible against the aged surface, a symbol. She crouched down, brushing her fingers across the stone, tracing the strange, unfamiliar shape. It was barely there, like a ghost of a carving, but its presence sent a shiver down her spine. It felt wrong, as though it didn't belong in this world. Her pulse quickened as her mind raced. She had seen this before, somewhere in the depths of her research, in the murky histories of ancient beliefs. She had to know more. Just as she rose to her feet, a gust of wind swept through the cemetery, carrying with it a chill so cold it felt like ice against her skin. She froze. Something brushed against her, cold, invisible, like the whisper of a hand grazing her shoulder. Her breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, but there was nothing, only silence and rows of forgotten graves stretching into the fog. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. It felt as though the earth beneath her feet was shifting, trembling in some barely perceptible way, as though the dead below were stirring. She backed away from the grave, her heart hammering. Whatever was happening, whatever had begun with the arrival of the letter, It was far from over. She hurried back to her car, the wind biting at her skin as if trying to push her away from the graveyard. Her mind raced, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed her, that unseen eyes still lingered. The symbol on Robert's grave burned in her memory, its meaning elusive but undeniably dark. Whatever connection it held to the letter was more sinister than she'd imagined. As she drove away from the cemetery, she couldn't stop thinking about the letters, how they seemed to predict the future. Her mind replayed the final line of the first letter. "You will see them soon, one by one." And then the whispers in her house, the creak of the floorboards. What if it wasn't just her that was in danger? The thought chilled her. She had to know if the letter's cryptic message was referring to others, people she knew. The uneasy feeling of impending doom settled like a weight on her chest as she pulled into her driveway. Without wasting time, she headed inside, threw off her coat, and immediately searched for the envelope. When she found it, something inside her told her to look more carefully, as if a hidden truth awaited her in its folds. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter again, scanning the familiar words. And then there, at the bottom of the page, beneath Robert's chilling signature, was a faint, almost invisible marking, a new message she hadn't noticed before, like ink that had appeared only after she had read it the first time. "They are next. Watch the ones around you." A sharp breath caught in her throat as she read the names listed beneath the warning. The list started with a name she recognized immediately. A neighbor. Below it, more names followed, each one a person she knew. A co-worker, a friend from years ago, a cousin she hadn't spoken to in ages. And at the very bottom, in the same trembling handwriting, a final name. Hers. Her blood ran cold. The implications were horrifying. The letter wasn't just a threat. It was a list. These people, they were the ones who would die next. Panic surged through her. She had to warn them, stop whatever was happening. She grabbed her phone, quickly dialing her neighbor's number, the first name on the list. The phone rang endlessly, each unanswered ring deepening her sense of dread. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voicemail picked up. She left a hurried message, urging them to call her back immediately. But something deep inside her whispered that it was already too late. The letter had spoken the truth once before, and now it was happening again. She paced the floor, heart pounding, unsure of what to do next. Just as she began to consider driving to her neighbor's house herself, the phone rang. Startled, she snatched it up, her hands slick with sweat. The voice on the other end wasn't her neighbor. It was someone from the local news. Her neighbor had been in a fatal accident. They explained the details with clinical detachment, but all she could hear was the echo of the letter's words reverberating in her mind. The accident mirrored the letter's ominous description perfectly, down to the most chilling detail. Her heart raced as she hung up. The first prediction had come true. The others wouldn't be far behind. Over the next few days, she tried to warn the others. She called, left messages, knocked on doors, but no one believed her. They dismissed her concerns as paranoia, perhaps still in shock over the sudden death of their neighbor. Each rejection weighed heavier on her soul, the ticking clock of the letter's predictions looming ever larger in her mind. The second letter arrived soon after. This time, the message was shorter, more direct. "They won't listen, but you already knew that. You can't stop this. One by one, they will fall." The darkness that had been creeping at the edges of her life now seemed to press in closer. She began hearing whispers more frequently, low, indistinct voices that seemed to rise from the very walls of her home. At night, the shadows in her house shifted, twisting into shapes that disappeared the moment she turned her head. She caught glimpses of movement in the mirror, figures standing just behind her, watching. But when she blinked, they were gone. Her fear twisted into desperation. She had to stop this. But the more she tried to intervene, the more it seemed as though the world was unraveling around her. The deaths kept coming, each one eerily following the script laid out in Robert's letters. And she was running out of time. The whispers were louder now, the shadows darker, and always, her name lingered at the bottom of the list. Each passing day brought a suffocating sense of doom. She felt trapped in a waking nightmare, where reality twisted and bent under the weight of something unseen but always there, lurking in the periphery of her life. The deaths continued, just as the letter had foretold. Another name crossed off the list, a distant family member, their life snuffed out in a freak accident. She could see the pattern now. It wasn't just death, it was death-shaped, controlled, like the world around her was being manipulated by invisible hands, bending to the will of the letters. The nights became unbearable. The whispers, once distant murmurs, now spoke her name with chilling clarity, voices emerging from the cracks in the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from the shadows that deepened in the corners of her vision. Each night, the sensation of being watched grew stronger, until it became impossible to dismiss. She could feel it, a presence lingering just out of reach, like a pair of eyes forever fixed on her. The air in her home had grown thick, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was conspiring to crush her. Every time she thought she caught movement out of the corner of her eye, her heart would lurch, but when she turned to look, nothing. Yet she knew something was there, hiding just beyond the veil of the visible world. It started with the phone calls. At first, she thought it was just a technical glitch, strange static-filled calls from unknown numbers that never lasted more than a few seconds. But the more they happened, the more unsettling they became. The static was always there, but faintly, beneath it, she could hear voices, whispering. And then, one night, the static broke, and through it she heard a voice. A single, distorted whisper. Soon, her blood turned to ice. The phone slipped from her hand, and she backed away from it as though it had turned into something monstrous. She stared at the screen, half expecting the phone to ring again, but the silence was worse. The feeling of being watched was so intense now, it was almost unbearable. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, shapes she couldn't fully comprehend. At night, she caught glimpses of figures standing at the foot of her bed, pale and featureless, vanishing the moment she dared to focus on them. But they were there. They were real. The realization clawed its way into her mind. This wasn't just a haunting. The letters weren't simply predicting death. They were controlling it. The whispers, the shadows, the creeping dread, everything was connected, and the dead man, Robert, was orchestrating it all from beyond the grave. His death had been a ritual, a means to an end, and now, somehow, she had become entangled in it. Desperation gnawed at her every waking moment. She couldn't keep living this way, not with the suffocating knowledge that death was stalking her, that the letters were a cruel countdown. She had to find answers. There had to be a way to stop it. The symbol on Robert's grave. It was the key. She was sure of it now. She needed to understand what it meant, how it tied to the unnatural forces that had taken over her life. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed help from someone who knew the old ways, the ancient knowledge that had been buried beneath years of history. In a haze of desperation, she sought out a local historian, an eccentric, reclusive man who had spent decades researching the town's forgotten past. His home was buried in dust and cobwebs, every surface covered in old books and strange artifacts from forgotten eras. He greeted her with suspicion, but allowed her inside when she showed him a photograph of the symbol from Robert's tombstone. He studied it for a long time, his face growing paler as the seconds ticked by. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes wide with something that was not quite fear, but recognition. This symbol, it's old, very old, older than this town, older than the land itself, he muttered. his voice barely above a whisper. "It's part of a belief that the dead can manipulate the living if the proper rites are performed. A crossing between the two worlds. But this is not just folklore. This is something darker. Rituals like this are used to cheat death." He explained that the symbol marked the boundary between the living and the dead. It was part of an ancient practice, a ritual meant to bind the soul of the deceased to the living world, allowing them to influence events even after death. Robert hadn't simply committed suicide. He had performed a dark ritual, one meant to transcend the boundaries of life itself. "You're telling me Robert isn't dead?" she asked, her voice shaking. The historian leaned back in his chair, his eyes shadowed with unease. "Not in the way you think. His body is dead, yes, but his soul, his essence, remains tethered. The letters you've been receiving, they're part of this. A ritual to claim more souls, to feed the connection he's created. Every death strengthens his hold on our world." A wave of nausea rolled through her. It all made sense now. The deaths, the letters, the growing presence of shadows and whispers, they were part of the ritual. And she was the final piece. "Is there a way to stop it?" she asked, desperate, the words tumbling out before she could stop herself. The historian hesitated, his eyes darting to the symbol. "There may be a way," he said slowly, "but it will require confronting him, breaking the ritual where it began." Her heart sank as she realized what he meant. She would have to return to Robert's grave, face whatever was waiting for her there. The drive back to Robert's grave felt like descending into a nightmare she couldn't escape. The historian's words echoed in her mind, replaying over and over. Robert wasn't just dead. He was tethered, manipulating reality from some twisted in-between place. And she was part of it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive weight in the air grew thicker, the wind howling like distant voices. She felt the eyes again, those invisible watchers, always present, always just out of sight. The world itself seemed to close in around her, as though the space between the living and the dead had grown dangerously thin. By the time she arrived at the cemetery, night had fully claimed the sky. The old, forgotten gravestones jutted up from the earth like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows across the frost-kissed ground. But she barely noticed them. Her focus was on one spot, Robert's grave. She made her way toward it, each step heavy with dread. The sensation of being watched grew sharper, more invasive, as if dozens of unseen eyes tracked her every movement. Her breath clouded in the air, and the temperature plummeted the closer she got. When she reached the grave, she stood still, the earth beneath her feeling as fragile as the boundary she was about to cross. There was no mistaking it now. Something was waiting for her here, something old and filled with malice. The symbol on the tombstone seemed to pulse in the dim moonlight, as though it were alive, feeding on the fear that gripped her. She pulled the latest letter from her coat pocket, her hands trembling. She hadn't opened it yet. She couldn't bear to. But she knew now that this was no longer about mere warnings. The letters were not just predicting the deaths. They were creating them, each one pulling the veil between the worlds thinner and thinner. Her name was on the final letter. She was next. As she stood before the grave, the air seemed to shift, growing heavier, almost suffocating. The whispers began again, low at first, but rising, swirling around her like a storm. She could almost make out the words, her name tangled in the sound. Suddenly, she heard a creak behind her, the sound of shifting earth. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest. But there was no one there, only shadows, deep, dark shapes stretching from the graves, creeping closer, almost alive. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was him, Robert. His form was pale, almost translucent, his eyes hollow, dark pits staring at her with a hatred that radiated from the very air around him. He wasn't human anymore. His body was long gone, decayed, but his presence was here, stronger than ever, and he was controlling it all. Every death, every whisper, every shadow that had crept into her life. "You've been a part of this since the beginning," his voice rasped, each word carrying the weight of something unnatural, something that shouldn't exist. "Everything that has happened, it was always leading to this." She backed away, but the shadows around her tightened, as though they had formed a cage. There was no escape. Robert's figure moved closer, his form flickering in and out of the darkness like a fading memory, yet more real than anything else in the world. "You will complete the ritual," he hissed, his voice like nails scraping against her mind. "You have no choice. Your death will seal the bond, and I will walk among the living once again." Her mind raced. The historian had warned her. This was about power, about tethering the dead to the world of the living. Robert needed her death to finish what he had started. The others were just steps toward this final act, their lives sacrificed to bring him closer to life. And now it was her turn. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Clutching the letter tightly, she shouted, "I know what you've done. I know about the ritual. It ends here." The ground beneath her feet trembled, and Robert's figure faltered for a brief moment. His hollow eyes narrowed, his voice growing darker, deeper. "You think you can break this? The moment you opened that first letter, you became part of it. Your fate was sealed. This is beyond you, beyond life itself." But she refused to believe that. Her mind flashed to the historian's warning. There was a way to break the ritual. She had to sever the connection, to stop feeding the bond between the living and the dead. She knelt before the tombstone, frantically searching her pockets for the lighter she had brought. Robert's shadow loomed over her, growing darker, more solid. The whispers became a deafening roar as the ground beneath her shifted. But she found it, the lighter. With shaking hands, she ignited the flame and held it to the final letter. The paper began to curl, blackening at the edges, the fire consuming it inch by inch. The air around her exploded with a violent gust, as though the very cemetery was resisting her, fighting to stop her from destroying the last piece of the ritual. Robert screamed, a blood-curdling wail that echoed through the graveyard, shaking the earth and sending icy fingers of terror through her. His form flickered violently, becoming unstable, his face contorting in rage and pain. "No!" he howled, his voice distorting, growing weaker as the flames devoured the letter. "You can't stop this." But she could. She had to. As the final corner of the letter burned away, Robert's figure dissolved into the night, his scream cut short. The shadows that had surrounded her seemed to melt into the ground, disappearing into the cold, silent earth. The whispers ceased, and for the first time in weeks, there was nothing but stillness. It was over, or so she thought. The silence that followed Robert's scream was profound, but not peaceful. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. She stood there, staring at the blackened remains of the final letter, her body trembling with exhaustion, her heart racing in her chest. The cemetery was still now, the shadows no longer shifting, the whispers gone. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over, that the burning of the letter had severed the ritual, that Robert's twisted grasp on the living world had finally been broken. But the air around her felt strange, thick with something unseen, something that hadn't been there before. Her relief was short-lived, replaced by an unsettling awareness that something wasn't right. The cold wind that had been so persistent before had died down, and the world seemed unnaturally quiet. Too quiet. As she stepped away from Robert's grave, her legs shaky beneath her, she felt it again, the feeling of being watched. Her pulse quickened, and her eyes darted around the cemetery, scanning the darkness for any movement, any sign of lingering danger. But this wasn't like before. The presence watching her now wasn't Robert's, nor was it the same oppressive force that had haunted her nights. This was something new, something far worse. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the truth. She had broken the ritual, yes, but in doing so, she had torn the veil between worlds, and something had slipped through. The thin boundary that separated the living from the dead was no longer intact. She could feel it, like a tear in the fabric of reality, widening with every breath she took. The shadows around the cemetery had deepened, and though she couldn't see them, she knew that something was there, lurking just beyond her vision. The dead were no longer contained. They were watching, waiting. The historian's words echoed in her mind, crossing the boundaries between the living and the dead. Some rituals are not meant to be tampered with. Panic welled up inside her. She needed to leave, needed to get away from this place. But even as she turned to flee, the weight of those unseen eyes followed her, dragging her down. The figures in the corners of her vision, the ones she had glimpsed for weeks, were no longer content to remain in the background. They were closer now, closer than ever. She stumbled through the cemetery, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her mind racing. She had thought destroying the letters would free her, but instead she had opened a door to something much darker, something far more dangerous than Robert's ritual. The veil had been torn, and now the dead could reach her in ways they hadn't before. When she finally reached her car, she fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking violently. As soon as the engine roared to life, she sped down the road, desperate to put as much distance between herself and the cemetery as possible. But the feeling of being followed, of being watched, didn't fade. It clung to her, like a dark, invisible presence that had latched onto her soul. The whispers returned as she drove, faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. But then they grew louder, more distinct, as though the very air around her had been corrupted by whatever had slipped through the veil. The figures she had glimpsed in the shadows now appeared in every reflective surface, flashes of faces in the rearview mirror, pale eyes staring back at her from the side windows. She couldn't escape them. They were everywhere. And then she saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the road ahead, illuminated by her headlights. It was tall, gaunt, its face hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowed with a pale, otherworldly light. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. Her heart pounded in her chest, terror gripping her as the figure stood motionless in the road, watching her. It wasn't Robert. It wasn't human. For what felt like an eternity, the figure didn't move. It just stared, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness, through the windshield, and directly into her soul. And then, slowly, deliberately, it lifted one hand, pointing directly at her. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her with chilling clarity. The ritual had been broken, but something else had taken Robert's place. The days that followed were a blur of terror. The whispers no longer came at night. They followed her everywhere. The shadows moved on their own, creeping closer with each passing hour. And the figure, it was always there, sometimes just at the edge of her vision, sometimes standing in plain sight. It never spoke, never moved. It only watched. But she could feel its intent. It was waiting, waiting for her to slip, to falter. She knew now that her life would never return to what it had been. The letters had stopped, yes, but the bargain she had made with the dead was far from over. Whatever force had crossed over from the other side had claimed her. It was watching, waiting, and when the time came, it would take her. She had severed the ritual, but in doing so, she had torn open a rift between the worlds, a rift that could never be closed. The dead no longer needed letters to reach her. They had found another way. The cemetery was silent now, the weight of the ritual's ending still thick in the air. She stood there, breathing heavily, the charred remains of the letter crumbling at her feet. Robert's scream still echoed in her mind, but the presence she had felt for so long seemed to have faded, retreating back into the darkness from which it came. But then, just as relief began to settle in, a tremor passed through the earth. The wind picked up, swirling around her, and the shadows deepened once more. It was as though the ground itself was awakening, responding to something far older and more powerful than Robert's twisted ritual. She glanced down, her eyes widening in horror. Lying at her feet, untouched by the flames, was a final letter, a letter she hadn't seen before, one she had never opened. Her heart raced as she crouched down to pick it up, her fingers trembling. The envelope was worn, the edges yellowed like the others, but this one felt different. There was a weight to it, a finality, as if everything had been leading to this very moment. The sense of dread returned with a vengeance, clawing at her insides as she tore open the envelope. Inside, the letter was brief, written in the same shaky, distorted handwriting as before. But it wasn't Robert's words that sent a shiver through her. It was the message itself. Your life, or theirs. The ground beneath her feet rumbled again, as though the earth itself was coming alive. Shadows rose from the graves, swirling around her in an almost hypnotic dance. The final choice lay before her now, a choice she couldn't escape. The dead man had left her with an ultimatum: her life, or the lives of others. The bargain wasn't over. Not yet. In her hand, the letter seemed to pulse with dark energy, as though it were alive. She knew, deep down, that Robert had set this final trap for her, a twisted choice that would seal her fate. If she chose her own life, others would pay the price. And if she chose to sacrifice herself, the ritual would finally be complete, and Robert's grip on the living world would be broken. But was it truly that simple? Could she trust the words of a man who had manipulated her from beyond the grave? The shadows circled closer, pressing in on her from all sides. Her chest tightened, and the air felt thick with malice, as though the very darkness around her was waiting for her to make a decision. Her hand tightened around the letter, her mind racing. She had come this far, faced unimaginable horrors, and now it all came down to this final, impossible choice. Time seemed to stretch out endlessly as she stood there, the choice hanging over her like a noose. She knew that whatever she chose, there would be no going back. The future itself seemed to bend around her, warping under the weight of the decision she had to make. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the whispers that rose once again from the shadows, the voice of Robert echoing in her mind. The dead man had woven a web around her life, trapping her in this twisted game of death and sacrifice. But now, at the edge of it all, she realized that the power wasn't entirely his. The choice was hers. Slowly, she opened her eyes and gazed at the letter in her hand. The words shimmered, as though alive, as though waiting for her to make her move. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers growing louder, urging her to decide. She took a deep breath, her mind clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The faces of those who had already fallen flashed before her eyes. The neighbor, the family friend, the distant cousin. She could see their deaths clearly now, each one orchestrated by the same malevolent force that had been stalking her from the moment the first letter arrived. And then, in that moment, she made her choice. With a slow, deliberate motion, she tore the letter in half. The effect was immediate. The shadows that had been circling her recoiled, the whispers rising into a cacophony of screams as the very fabric of reality seemed to twist around her. The ground shook violently, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it felt as though the world itself was being torn apart. But then, as quickly as it had started, the tremors stopped. The air grew still. The shadows faded back into the earth, disappearing into the graves from which they had risen. The oppressive weight that had been suffocating her lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the night was silent. She stood alone in the cemetery, the torn pieces of the letter fluttering to the ground at her feet. The choice had been made, the bargain struck. She didn't know what the future held, whether she had truly broken the ritual or merely delayed its inevitable return. But in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. The weight of Robert's twisted manipulation had been lifted. The dead man's grasp had been broken. But even as she turned to leave the cemetery, her mind couldn't help but wander back to the warning in the final letter. Your life, or theirs. She had torn the letter in defiance, refusing to play by Robert's rules, but a part of her wondered if the price had already been paid. If, in making her choice, she had unknowingly set something else in motion, something darker, something beyond even Robert's control. As she walked away from the graveyard, the night felt unnaturally quiet. The unseen eyes that had followed her for so long seemed to fade, but deep down, she knew something still lingered. The ritual might have been broken, but the veil between the worlds had been torn. And now, something darker was watching from the other side. The letters had stopped, but the haunting presence that had followed her remained. She could feel it in the stillness of the night, in the shadows that clung to the corners of her home. The veil between the living and the dead had been torn open, and even though Robert's grip had been severed, something else had crossed over. It watched her now, patient and silent, waiting for the moment when she would slip. She had escaped the ritual, but she hadn't escaped the consequences. The dead might no longer send letters, but they were still there, always watching, always waiting. And though her life had been spared, the presence that now lingered would never leave. It starts with exhaustion. Weeks of sleepless nights have left you frayed at the edges, stumbling through days in a haze of fatigue. Your mind spins with anxiety, restless thoughts tangling in a loop. Finally, after another torturous night spent staring at the ceiling, you drift into an uneasy sleep. But peace doesn't come. Sometime in the dead hours of the night, you awaken, your eyes snap open, and immediately you know something is wrong. You can see the familiar shapes of your room, the dresser, the curtains slightly swaying, the dim light from the street lamp filtering through the window. But something feels off. You try to move. Nothing happens. Your heart begins to race. Panic rises as you realize you can't even twitch a finger. Your body is rigid, completely frozen beneath the blankets. You try to scream, but your throat feels closed off, as if an invisible hand is pressing down on your chest. All you can do is lie there, helpless. Then you see it. At the foot of your bed, something shifts in the shadows. It's subtle at first, just a dark shape, standing where no shape should be. But as your eyes adjust, the figure comes into focus. Tall, impossibly thin, and utterly still. It's as if the very darkness has taken form. The air in the room changes, growing heavier, colder. The figure doesn't move, doesn't breathe. It just watches. There's something about it, something wrong, something that makes every instinct scream that this isn't a nightmare. It's real, too real. Then it begins to whisper. The sound is faint at first, barely audible, like wind through a crack in the window. But it grows louder, curling around your mind like a snake, speaking in a language you don't understand but instinctively fear. You strain against your frozen body, desperate to break free, to make a sound, anything to stop the whispering. The minutes stretch on, each second dripping with terror, until finally, without warning, the figure vanishes. The weight lifts from your chest. Your body jolts, freed from the invisible chains, and you bolt upright, gasping for air. The room is still, eerily quiet, as if nothing had happened. But you know better. It wasn't a dream. It couldn't have been. The cold sweat clinging to your skin, the pounding of your heart. It's too real. You glance at the foot of your bed, half expecting to see the figure still there, but it's gone. Yet the feeling lingers, that sensation of being watched. as if something is still in the room, hiding just beyond your sight. You don't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day drags on in a blur of exhaustion. Every shadow seems to stretch longer, darker. You shake off the memory of the night before, telling yourself it was just sleep paralysis, something you've read about but never experienced. A hallucination brought on by stress, nothing more. But when the sun sets again, fear creeps in with the night. Still, eventually, you can't resist sleep. Your body demands rest. This time, it happens faster. Barely an hour into a fitful sleep, you're awake again, frozen, paralyzed, and it's there. The figure has returned. But this time, it's closer. You feel your heart hammering as you realize it's no longer at the foot of the bed. It stands beside you now, its hollow eyes boring into you with an intensity that sends a wave of dread down your spine. The pressure on your chest returns, more forceful, as though something cold is pressing directly on your skin. You try to scream, to move, but the darkness has you in its grip once more. Then, the whispering starts again, louder this time, not from the figure itself, but from inside your own head. The words, still incomprehensible, echo within your skull, drowning out any rational thought. Suddenly, you feel it, an icy touch on your chest, a hand, too real, too solid. Your breath catches in your throat as the fingers press harder. This is not a dream. You can feel the weight of the hand, the cold seeping into your bones. It's leaning closer now. The whispers grow louder, frantic, and you know, with a certainty that chills you to the core, that the figure isn't going to leave this time. Just when the pressure becomes unbearable, when you feel you might suffocate, the figure vanishes again. The cold lingers in the air, but your body is your own once more. You sit up, gasping, clutching your chest where the icy hand had been. But there's no mark, no evidence, only the lingering terror. This time, you don't wait for morning. Grabbing your phone, you search for answers. Sleep paralysis, night terrors, anything that can explain what's happening. You find countless articles, but none of them bring comfort. They talk about hallucinations, brain chemicals, tricks of the mind. But what you've seen, what you've felt, it was real. Frustrated, you dig deeper, finding an online forum dedicated to sleep disorders. Thread after thread details experiences like yours. The paralysis, the figures, the whispers. And then you find something that stops your breath. A post from someone who describes the same figure. Tall, shadowy, with hollow eyes. The more you read, the more horrified you become. Others have seen it too. But some describe it going further, leaving the edges of the bed, stepping into the waking world. The fear grips you tighter now, sinking in like ice. You know, deep down, that this isn't just in your mind. The figure is real, and it's not finished with you yet. The days blur together as you obsess over the forum. The posts you read echo your own experiences, each more terrifying than the last. People from different corners of the world all describe the same dark figure, gaunt, hollow-eyed, lingering at the edges of their beds. They, too, hear the whispers. They, too, feel its cold, suffocating presence. One user, No Sleep 4 Days, describes something that makes your stomach churn. I thought it was just a nightmare, but then it moved. It left the foot of the bed and came closer. I could see its face, if you can even call it that. Those eyes, they don't just look at you, they see you, like they're inside your head. And the worst part, I felt it. Its fingers, freezing. It touched me. I couldn't breathe. You scroll through the responses, each one worse than the last. More people are experiencing the same entity, and they're all convinced it's something more than sleep paralysis. No one can explain it, but everyone feels it, that creeping, sickening fear that it isn't just in their heads. The posts keep coming. Night after night, people are being visited by this figure, this shadow. And as the reports grow, a pattern emerges. The entity isn't just lurking at the edge of sleep anymore. It's getting bolder, stronger. Some users talk about seeing it when they're fully awake. One post in particular makes your breath catch. The whispering, it's getting louder. I woke up yesterday, and I swore I heard it, even though I wasn't asleep. It was calling my name. How could it know my name? The forum has become a hive of fear, buzzing with the stories of victims from every time zone. Some users stop posting altogether after their final, frantic messages, warnings, pleas for help. But there's nothing to be done, nothing that can explain the growing nightmare. Soon, moderators step in, attempting to calm the panic. They lock the threads discussing the shadow figure, claiming it's only making things worse, fueling paranoia. But the fear has already spread too far. The warnings go unnoticed, buried under new posts that pop up faster than they can be shut down. Then, something changes. A new wave of posts floods in from those who say the figure is no longer confined to their sleep paralysis episodes. They've seen it standing in the corners of their rooms, reflected in mirrors, its hollow eyes following them long after they wake up. You scroll through the desperate messages. I was brushing my teeth this morning, and I saw it in the mirror. It was right behind me. I turned around, but it was gone. I haven't slept since. I can feel it watching me, even in the daylight. I keep thinking I see it in the shadows, but when I look, there's nothing there. But I know it's real. I know it's coming back. The posts are relentless, one after the other, each more disturbing than the last. People are no longer safe, even in the waking world. It's as though the shadow has broken through, crossed some unseen boundary, and now it's stalking its prey, biding its time. Suddenly, you realize something chilling. The figure isn't just feeding on fear during the paralysis episodes. It's using the fear you carry with you during the day, growing stronger, creeping closer. The night comes again, and with it, a new terror. You try everything to avoid sleep, coffee, pacing, blasting music. But eventually, your body betrays you. Your eyelids grow heavy, and before you know it, you're sinking into your bed, consciousness fading. When you wake, it's not from sleep paralysis. You're standing in the bathroom, staring at your reflection in the mirror. At first, everything seems normal. Just you, pale and exhausted, the dim light casting shadows under your eyes. But then you notice it. The figure. It's standing behind you, close enough to touch. The air around you grows cold, a chill so deep it feels like the marrow in your bones is freezing. Your mouth opens in a silent scream as you whirl around, but there's nothing there. Just the empty bathroom, the dark hallway beyond. Your heart is pounding, your breath coming in ragged gasps, but the figure is gone. Yet the cold remains, like a lingering promise. You stumble back to your room, too shaken to think clearly. You know what you saw. It was real. The figure has crossed over into your waking life now, invading your reality. Suddenly, your phone buzzes with a notification. It's the forum. Another post, but this one is different. It's from a user who claims to have seen the shadow outside their home, standing under a street lamp, waiting. They talk about the whispers growing louder, clearer, calling their name again and again. Your skin crawls as you read the final words. It's not just in my dreams anymore. It's here. It's always been here. The days blur together, each filled with an undercurrent of dread. The figure is always in the back of your mind, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Your waking hours offer no relief. You feel its presence even under the harsh light of day. You avoid mirrors now, afraid of what might be watching from the other side. Every corner of your home feels unsafe. every shadow a potential hiding place for that thing. In desperation, you dive deeper into the forum, hoping to find someone, anyone, who has answers. That's when you come across a user who seems different. Shadowseeker doesn't just share stories. They've been researching the figures, hunting for a connection between the experiences. Their posts are filled with references to ancient texts, folklore, and chilling legends from around the world. One post stands out. It's long, dense, packed with references to old mythologies and obscure writings. Shadowseeker claims that the figures people are seeing aren't hallucinations at all. They're something much older. These entities, what we're seeing in sleep paralysis, they've been described before. In ancient cultures, shadow beings, or night visitors, were believed to feed on fear. They're drawn to those in vulnerable states, especially when the mind and body are separated, like during sleep paralysis. And here's the terrifying part. The more fear they consume, the stronger they become. Eventually, if they've fed enough, they can fully manifest in our world. Your heart skips a beat as you read the next sentence. This isn't a dream anymore. It's happening. The post continues with disturbing details. Stories of similar creatures found in forgotten texts from ancient civilizations. They were called by different names, but the descriptions are eerily familiar. Hollow eyes, whispers that fill the mind, cold that seeps into the bones. According to the lore, these creatures have always existed, lurking at the edges of human consciousness, waiting for moments of weakness. The realization hits you like a punch to the gut. These aren't just hallucinations. They're real. And with each passing night, with each victim's fear, they are growing stronger. The next night is worse. You try to stay awake, but exhaustion weighs down on you like a heavy blanket. When you finally close your eyes, the darkness envelopes you faster than ever before. It's as if you're being pulled into sleep by an invisible force, deeper and deeper, until you wake, paralyzed. The figure is back, but this time, it's not just standing by the bed. It's right above you, looming, its hollow eyes burning into yours. The pressure on your chest is unbearable, like a cold weight pressing you down, stealing your breath. And then you feel it, its touch. A claw-like hand wraps around your wrist, cold and bony, with a grip that feels all too real. The whispers are louder now, no longer soft murmurings, but a relentless barrage of incomprehensible words. It's inside your head, filling every corner of your mind with dread. You can't move. You can't scream. The terror is overwhelming, suffocating, and as your fear spikes, something happens. The figure grows more solid. It's no longer just a shadow. It has weight, mass. You can feel the ice-cold breath of the creature on your skin. It leans in closer, whispering louder, and for the first time, you catch a word. A name. Your name. Suddenly, you break free from the paralysis with a violent jerk, gasping for air. The figure vanishes, but you know now it wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real, and it's growing more powerful. The next morning, you notice something strange. Bruises on your wrist, the exact spot where the figure had grabbed you. The forum is quiet now. Too quiet. Where there had been dozens of new posts every night, now there are only a few. Many of the regular users have stopped posting altogether. You check their profiles. Some haven't logged in for days, others for weeks. And the posts that remain, they're chilling. People are disappearing. One by one, the most frequent posters have gone silent. The last messages they left behind are filled with desperation, fragmented warnings that make your skin crawl. I can hear it even when I'm awake. It's whispering my name. It's in my house. It's too late. It's crossed over. It's everywhere now. The worst post comes from someone who had been active on the forum for months. Their final message sends a shiver down your spine. They took my brother. I heard him screaming from the shadows, begging me to help him. But I can't. I can't go near the dark anymore. I think they've got him. I think I'm next. And then nothing. Silence. You realize that the creatures aren't just feeding off fear. They're taking people. There are reports of victims vanishing, their beds left cold and empty, as if they were never there at all. Others leave behind signs of struggle, scratches on the walls, broken furniture. Some survivors claim to hear the voices of the missing, echoing from the darkest corners of their homes, pleading for help. But no one ever finds them. The fear is suffocating now. You feel it in every moment, awake or asleep, a constant, gnawing presence at the edge of your mind. The figure, the shadow, it's no longer just a visitor in the night. It's a predator, and you are its prey. It's hunting you, feeding on your terror, growing stronger with every passing hour. But you're not alone. Through the forum, you connect with others, survivors, people who refuse to go quietly into the dark. There's a small group, hidden in the private threads, sharing whatever scraps of information they can find. They've all experienced the same thing. The figure, the cold, the whispers. Some have seen it in their waking lives. Others have suffered its attacks night after night. But all of them have reached the same grim conclusion. The creatures are real, and they won't stop until they have consumed every last drop of fear. Among the group, one voice stands out, a user who goes by Nightwatcher. They've been researching these entities for years, far longer than anyone else. Nightwatcher believes there's a way to fight back. Ancient rituals, forgotten by time, buried in obscure texts and rituals that could potentially ward off or even banish the creatures. But there's a problem. These protections are temporary, fleeting shields against an enemy that adapts, that thrives on resistance. Every time someone fights back, the creatures come harder, angrier, more vicious. Nightwatcher warns the group. The more you resist them, the more determined they become. They want you to fight, because when you lose, they grow stronger than ever. Still, the group has no choice. Either they fight, or they succumb to the darkness. The first step is gathering supplies. Candles, symbols of protection, words from ancient books that have been passed down for centuries. The group tries everything. Salt circles, prayers, incantations from every corner of the world. For a time, it works. The shadows stay at bay, lurking at the edges, but always watching, waiting for their moment to strike. And then, one night, one of the group goes silent. The disappearance is sudden, without warning. The victim, someone who had been sharing tips and survival tactics for weeks, vanishes after sending a chilling message. It's here. I can feel it. Watching me. I don't think I have long. You and the others wait for another post, another update. But none comes. Their profile shows offline, and the private messages go unanswered. Fear grips the group tighter, knowing that one of them has been taken. The shadows are closing in, feeding on the rising terror. Nightwatcher grows frantic. They push the group harder, urging them to try one final ritual, something ancient, dangerous, and possibly their only hope. But the cost is immense. The ritual, said to have been used by shamans and mystics centuries ago to banish evil entities, requires a sacrifice. Not just any sacrifice, though. A life must be given willingly, offered to the darkness in exchange for the chance to close the door between worlds that has been torn open. The group is torn. Who would make such a sacrifice? Could they even trust the ritual to work? As they prepare for the final confrontation, the atmosphere is thick with dread. The shadows have grown more aggressive, materializing not just in dreams but in reality. Every dark corner pulses with an unnatural energy, and the cold in the air is unbearable, a sign that the creatures are nearly strong enough to fully cross over. Then, without warning, another member of the group disappears. One moment they were discussing the plan, the next they were gone. taken by the shadows, claimed before the ritual could even begin. Despair hangs over the survivors. They know time is running out. The final night arrives. The group gathers in a darkened room, candles flickering in a circle of salt. The air feels heavy, charged with an oppressive weight, as though the walls themselves are closing in. You can feel the presence of the creatures all around you, just out of sight, waiting for the ritual to fail. Night Watcher takes the lead, chanting the ancient words, their voice steady but tense. The shadows seem to pulse in response, creeping closer, drawn to the power of the ritual. The candles flicker violently, casting twisted shapes on the walls, shapes that move and writhe like living things. And then the whispers start, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with every breath. The creatures are near, just beyond the edge of the light. You feel the cold, that bone-chilling cold, sinking into your flesh. The shadows flicker and stretch, the hollow-eyed figures waiting, watching. The ritual calls for a sacrifice. The final step is near. Someone has to offer themselves willingly, to close the door that has been torn open, to stop the creatures from crossing fully into the world. The group hesitates, fear paralyzing their movements. But as the shadows grow darker, colder, one of the survivors steps forward. Their voice is quiet, resigned. It has to be me. The ritual continues, the words of the sacrifice spoken. The shadows seem to scream in silent rage, the cold intensifying, the whispers turning into a cacophony of maddening voices. The figure at the center of the ritual trembles, their life slipping away as the sacrifice is made. The door between worlds, the rift that has allowed the creatures to enter, begins to close. For a moment, there is a deafening silence. Then, a final gust of freezing wind extinguishes the candles. The room is plunged into darkness. You can feel it, the presence of the creatures slipping away, their power fading. But as the last words of the ritual echo into the night, you wonder, did it truly work? Or have the shadows only retreated, waiting for their next opportunity? The forum is abandoned now. No new posts, no updates, just silence. But if you dig deep enough, past the locked threads and forgotten accounts, you'll find something unsettling. Cryptic messages, scattered throughout the site, from new users. Their stories are the same. Sleep paralysis, the shadowy figures, the cold. The last post is recent, written by someone who just joined the forum. The words are short, simple, but they make your blood run cold. It's standing at the foot of my bed, watching, whispering, "Are you next?"